Well, my goodness, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Alan, it's all a little bit overwhelming. Now, I'd quite like to say, is the pitch of my voice correct? Can you? I'm not going to, actually, because I heard the other day of a lecturer who, a third of the way through his lecture, said, "Can you all hear me?" And somebody stood up immediately from the back and said, "Well, I can hear you very well, but I'd willingly swap places with anybody who can't." So I'm afraid I'm going to assume you can hear me. Alan, thank you for that really a little bit tear-jerking, I have to say, a little bit tear-jerking to see pictures, indeed hear the voice of my dear mother who, who died 2002, aged 91. And as Alan said, there was this quite remarkable friendship between my mother and Alan, dating back to the time when he was a young student in landscape architecture, landscape gardening at Manchester University, where only about 20 miles from Manchester. And anyway, it all went from there, and Alan's become a huge friend. But not only a huge friend, but a tremendous, tremendous supporter. You heard what he said about Arley. I mean, it's just amazing. But a tremendous supporter. And when he was over last summer, he said to me, "Michael, I think you ought to come over to give a lecture about Arley." So I said, "I can't do that." And he said, "Well, no." And after a bit, I discovered that he actually was serious. And he did want us to come. And it all went from there. And it's just been so exciting. And actually, I'm giving this talk 3 different times. This is actually the second. We've been up in the wonderful place called Winterthur, which some of you, many of you, perhaps all of you will know, a dream-like place. We were up there, and I gave this talk 2 days ago, and we got the most wonderful welcome. And I would like just to say that since we touched down at Philadelphia Airport only on Saturday, we've been met with nothing but kindness and friendliness and generosity. I always knew, I haven't been to America for very many years, but I don't know why not, more fool me. I'm certainly going to come back again soon because... But I've always known, because of course we've known a huge number of Americans in various ways. You all come over to Europe, thank goodness, and to England and come and see us, and we've had Americans at Arley. And I've always been told that you're tremendously friendly and hospitable in your own country, and my goodness, that's true. But before we get into the lecture, I would really like to say the most enormous thank you to, I'll have to sort of bracket people a bit, because we've had such help and support. I mean, it was Alan's idea that we should come on this trip, and as I say, it's like being a sort of royal progress. It's just, you know, you've just told what's going to happen next, and it does happen, and we just haven't had to think at all. The only thing is, it would be quite good if instead of there being 24 hours in the day, there were 36. Because, you know, it's been pretty action-packed and still is. But a tremendous, tremendous thank you to Alan for thinking of it all and setting it all up. And it's been a lot of work. And a very, very special thank you to Laura, who she and I have been in correspondence by email. Didn't always work at our end, the email. I don't know why not. Always worked at her end, of course, but by telephone. And our program has been set up. As I say, not only have they set up the program for here at Little Rock, but the program for further north where we started, and the program for where we're going. We're going down to Natchez, which I understand is the most beautiful place. So really looking forward to that. So thank you so much to everybody that's helped us. And it's been so wonderful to meet all Alan's team, and I know we're going to see a little bit more of them. So it's absolutely wonderful to be here. Now, I think we'd better get started with the lecture. Now then, there we are. Well, Arley Hall is as we know, it's in Cheshire. It's about 25 miles northeast of Chester. Chester, as you will know, is a very fine city, a beautiful historic city with a Roman wall still standing in large part. How about that? A Roman wall. Amazing, isn't it? And it really is. A lot of it is still standing and you can walk along it. So that's where we are. We're very close to Manchester Airport. Please remember that. Flying time from Philadelphia, 7 hours. Very easy. You have to, it's a bit further from here, I suppose. But very easy. 25 minutes from the airport, we can get you to Arley Hall. So, and we'll look after you if you come. We really will. So that's where we are. It is one of the few remaining historic estates in Cheshire still in private hands. There used to be many more. There are now not so many. So it's completely privately owned. It consists the estate of about 2,000 acres, 800 hectares of really mainly agricultural land. There's about 300 acres of woods, 25 or 30 or so houses, some connected to farms. And then, of course, at the centre we have the historic buildings, Arley Hall, the chapel, which you can see there. That's the chapel on the right there, Arley Hall. And of course, the gardens, which we're going to be talking about today. It's the ancestral home of the Warburton family, and you've seen and heard about my mother, Elizabeth. She was born Elizabeth Edgerton Warburton. She married my father in 1934. He was called Desmond Flower. That's our family name. And the Flower family home is in Southern Ireland, Castle Durrow, and the family left there at the time of so-called Troubles in 1922. And they settled at Arley, really, I suppose, from the end of the war onwards, because everything was a bit topsy-turvy until then. The Warburtons built their first house at Arley in 1470, so we've been there over 550 years, which is some time, I suppose. It does give one a funny sort of feeling, and a sort of a wonderful feeling, but also a great feeling of stewardship and responsibility. We don't want to be the ones to throw the towel in, and we're certainly not going to be. And I'm very glad to say that we've got 3 wonderful children, and in the normal way, our elder son, Roland, will be carrying on the tradition. He's 37, is he? And he's in the investment world. He lives now at Arley, just come up. He's working in Liverpool, but it's wonderful to have him around because we can talk about things, and he's getting involved in the business side of the place, and so on. So 1470, I should tell you, I haven't got time to go into this, but in 1968, half the house was demolished in the interests of labour saving. Extraordinary. Wouldn't have been able to do it now because it's a historic house and you couldn't just knock it down. But anyway, there we are. That's what actually happened. That, architecturally, Arley is 1840, that particular house. As I've explained, there were houses there on the site from the 15th century. They're all built on the same site. There was an 18th century one. Here we have the Victorian one. That is a good example of what we call early Victorian. They were copying the Jacobean and Elizabethan styles, as you will know. Pretty good copy. It's very, very sort of representational of the Elizabethan style, which is quite admired today. In my childhood, it wasn't so much, but it certainly is now. There we have a view of the another view of the house from the garden. We now are very much involved in functions and events, and of course the house and the garden are open to the visitors because it has to earn its keep, of course, as you'll understand. Zoe, my wife, and my family live in another house on the estate, on Arley Green, but it's important to say that we still, certainly we own, the family owns everything, and we very much control what happens there. I think the fact that we're privately owned does give it a certain je ne sais quoi, which you perhaps don't get in institutional places. Not that I'm in any way knocking those. There are some wonderful examples. But there's no doubt the visitors do remark on the personal touch which you get, and we have a great interrelationship with our visitors. So I think that's of interest. As I say, we're much involved in the tourism industry. The garden's open to the public. Actually, this year it's going to be open every day from spring to October, Easter to October. We have a lot of functions and events, both in the house and in other buildings, and also outside in the park. We have outside concerts. We have a tremendous number of wedding receptions, and things like antique fairs and receptions of all kinds. Weddings are absolutely wonderful for us. It's amazing what people pay for weddings. And long may that continue. No, really, it is incredible. And we now can have civil ceremonies, you know what I mean, in Arley Hall. We have a license for that. And about half of the events, about half the weddings are civil ceremony plus reception, and half are receptions following a church wedding. It's about like that. We'd better just get into the garden a bit in a minute, but one of the things I'd like to say about the garden, which I think gives it an interest and significance, is that, as Alan said, actually, it is now the culmination. Well, I hope it's not the culmination, because I hope it's going to go on being improved in the years to come, but it's really the first we really know about gardening very much at Arley is in the 18th century. Obviously, there was gardening, I'm quite sure, before then, but we don't know a huge amount about it. But actually, we know quite a lot about what happened in the 18th century, because we've got an enormous number, an awful lot of correspondence, an awful lot of receipts and invoices for plants, 6,000 invoices for plants bought in the 18th century. You have wonderful archives at Arley, which my marvellous brother-in-law, my sister's husband, is looking after and cataloguing and putting on the internet, and all that kind of thing is happening. Really the 18th century is when I'm going to start the sort of chronological tour of the garden. Now that is obviously, I say obviously, it's actually a 19th century photograph of a meet of foxhounds at Arley. And you'll see I talked about the partial demolition, and we lost the tower or dome at that time. That was taken down. Did give it a certain distinctiveness, the house. Actually, I have always really preferred it without it, but I'm not asking you to comment either way. Now we're in the 18th century. That is Sir Peter Warburton, the 4th Baronet. He inherited the estate in 1744. And this is his son, also called Peter, Sir Peter Warburton, the 5th Baronet. And they had a considerable influence at Arley. I'm not going to go into it a lot, but there were two particular things that between them they accomplished. One was they commissioned, and I say they because he came back twice, a well-known landscape architect of the 18th century called William Eames, similar time to Lancelot Brown and Repton. Not as well known, but he was highly skilled, William Eames, and he laid out the park. And the park is planted with trees and so on, and the park is tremendously important today in the landscape, as I'll explain a little bit later. The other thing, there's the, yes, that's one of the invoices, rather fun really. We've got 6,000 of those. £4, one shilling and 1786, plants bought, Sir Peter Warburton. Rather fun. Now, the other thing that they did in the 18th century, which is very, very important in terms of today's structure and design of the garden, as I'll show you in a bit more detail later, they built brick walls, and the reason I show you that section is that before the days of central heating and greenhouses and so on, in large gardens in England, the way they kept plants protected from frost and hard weather, they used to light fires outside the walls at intervals of about, say, 30 yards. These fires, and then the heat, there were flues inside the walls, and the heat went up, and they're called heated walls, and that warmed the climbing plants growing up the walls, the fruit. And it's amazing, really. And of course, the wall's still there, and that's, I think, not without interest. It's not unique to Arley, of course, at all, but we had it at Arley, and that photograph taken only about 10 years ago, I think. It's said that the most junior garden boy, his task would be to stay all night stoking the fires outside the walls. It must have been a boring job. Not sure it'd be quite past the health and safety tests which we're subjected to these days, but that's apparently what used to happen. So that's why I show you that picture. Now he is a remarkable gentleman. That is Roland Edgerton Warburton. Now he was my great-great-grandfather, and he was a wonderful man of enormous talent and artistic flair and creativity. He's been described as the kind of best type of country squire. He was actually very good at writing poetry. He wrote a lot of poetry and rhymes, and a lot of this is dotted round Arley. We got 3 rhyming signposts. One of it goes, "Trespassers this notice heed, onward you may not proceed, unless to Arley Hall you speed." And we've still got, and there are 2 or 3 others. And he wrote a very, very well-known volume called The Hunting Songs. He was a great hunt person. There he is in his hunt dress, fox hunting, of course. They all did that then and still do to some extent now, people. But a very, very interesting and volume of hunting songs by Roland Edgerton Warburton. And if first editions of those come up at Sotheby's or Christie's, they go for a bomb. I mean, it's very, very good. He was. And now he married a most charming and lovely lady called Mary Brooke, and that's her there. She came from another house in Cheshire called Norton Priory, which is still in very good heart. It's a private trust now, charitable trust. And Roland and Mary did an enormous amount at Arley. It's just absolutely amazing what they achieved. They built the present Arley Hall, as I've said. They built the private chapel, which is still have services in there once a month, evensong. They built a lot of houses on the estate and in neighboring villages. And in particular, for our purposes, they laid out the structure of the garden. So they achieved a huge amount. They had wonderful taste. They seemed to have endless money, which was absolutely amazing. They thought there ought to be a school at Arley, so they made a school, like you do. They thought there ought to be a chapel, so build a chapel, like you do. Wonderful, wonderful. Here we are. This is one of their first, the first I'm going to show you, feature. This is the Bleached Lime Avenue, and this is the quite grand approach to Arley as it now is, which the visitors come along. They walk along here towards the, they walk along there towards the stable clock, which you'll see closer up in a minute. Bleaching, as you will know, is the method of growing training in the narrow shape, very, very fashionable in England in the 19th century, and it's still being done today, and it's very effective. One of the interesting things about those trees, which is remarked on a lot by our visitors, is how narrow the trunks are. Because these trees were planted in 1860, so they're quite old. Now, you wouldn't, I'm not sure if you can tell from that, but take my word for it. The trunks are narrow for a tree 160 years old. Now, the reason for that, of course, is because they're clipped. And if you clip trees, hedges, of course, it puts them under stress, so they don't put on growth like that. But that's a point of interest. There you are, view of the Lime Avenue going away from the foreground area, which we call the stable yard. You'll see that in a moment. And then the building on the right of your picture is now, it's a 19th century building, which now used to be coach houses, subsequently garages. Now it serves as the ticket office and shop for the visitors. And I don't know whether you can see the date, 1845, which is indicative, and initials, probably can't see that terribly clear, RWM. So they loved putting their initials up everywhere, didn't they, in those days? And I don't know whether anyway. Now we come a little bit closer to the center of things. We're entering there the stable yard. The stable clock was put on that was put on in the 19th century by Roland, and which gives the place considerable character. And there we have a watercolor painting, two-thirds of the way through the 19th century, by my ancestor, my great-grandfather, Piers Edgerton Warburton. He was Roland's son, and he was a very good watercolor painter, and he loved painting buildings. And I show you that to indicate that really there's been really no change at all in the appearance of that area to what it is today. Perhaps you don't so often see horses like that, but other than that, no real difference. The building on the right, that one there, I'm now going to show you. Now that is, without question, the most important building we have at Arley in architectural terms. It's probably one of the simplest buildings. It's not complicated, as you can see, but it's the only building we have which is listed Grade 1 under our historic buildings legislation. Very important building. It's the upturned V shapes. That's called Crook formation, typical of the period, made from single oak trees, those trunks. And it's amazing to me, and possibly to you, that, I mean, that was built 1470 time when the Warburtons came to Arley. Well, obviously, the trees at that stage must have been, what, a couple of hundred years old at least, more possibly. And there they are, they just shove them up. I don't think they treated them in any particular, and they're still in tip-top condition today. Amazing. I sometimes think today's builders could learn a thing or two, but there we are. That's the Ride, we call it, because it was a riding school in the 19th century. That's a very important team of young gentlemen, team of gardeners. Going from left to right, Dave, James, Mark, Douglas, and on the right, Gordon, the head gardener. A wonderful team. You can't have a garden without gardeners. We're very, very blessed, and they do a wonderful job. We have a lot of volunteers, incidentally, too. We're very, very fortunate. There's a wonderful organization called the Friends of Arley, which exists to support the estate financially and in a lot of other ways, ambassadorially, and so on. Right, here we are in the garden proper. We're on this path, the gravel path is called the Furlong Walk, because it's exactly 220 yards in length, and that is a creation of Roland and Mary. They put that down on the axis of what previously had been the approach to Arley Hall, the main approach road, and they made that and sort of incorporated it into the garden. I mentioned the park earlier, designed by William Eames, and it's worth just spending a few seconds on this, I think, to point out that there it is. You walk along the Furlong Walk, and you have rather splendid views over the park and the trees, and you see the cattle and the sheep grazing. I think a lot of gardens in the UK of very great merit, but they suffer, it's not their fault, they suffer from being, I think, sometimes a little bit shut in. It's nice to have a feeling of spaciousness, and you'll certainly get that there. There are some fine trees in the park. One of the best is that one there. That's Quercus ceris, turkey oak, very fine tree, about 250 years old, branches splayed right down to ground level. Wonderful, sort of for children. There we get another view on the Furlong Walk in May. As you'll hear later, I'm a kind of rhodaholic. I love rhododendrons. Those are various hardy hybrids. Good splash of color in the month of May. And that's the winter. We've had, as you probably know, a couple of very, very hard winters in the UK recent years, which caused an awful lot of problems in an awful lot of areas. But by God, you've got some good photographs. There you go. There you go. Now, if the now that is without question. That's Alan showed you one or two of that. That is the herbaceous border. about 2/3 of it, that is. Now, there's no doubt at all that the herbaceous border is the feature for which Arley is best known. And there are a number of reasons for that. Incidentally, the herbaceous border, we keep it almost entirely to herbaceous perennials. Very few shrubs, a few bulbs, and a few annuals, but really herbaceous, because that is kind of the tradition of it, and that's what we like to do. It comes into its own about the end of May or early June, and it goes on until October or the first frosts. What we try to do, and Zoe is tremendously involved with the head gardener in this and does a wonderful job, we try to have it really looking good for a period of about 4 or 5 months. It's quite difficult with herbaceous plants, actually, because they come up and then they die down, and others come up, and it's quite a job. But there you go. And the building at the end is called the alcove. That's about 1790. Now, this herbaceous border is shown on a plan, which I'll show you shortly, 1846. And for that reason, it is thought that it's one of the earliest, if not the earliest, herbaceous borders in the country, because that is earlier for herbaceous border. But in fact, we are pretty sure that there was gardening going along that brick wall since the end of the 18th century. Why do I say that? Answer, because the building at the end, is the alcove, is about 1790, and we got all these invoices and plants. I think there was gardening going on. One or two things to say about this border. One is that it's got a lot of, it's quite wide or deep. It's about 15 meters from the yew hedge, which Roland planted in about 1850, and I told you earlier that the wall is 18th century. Now that's about 15 meters, which is quite wide, and that is good, I think, because it enables you to have more flexibility in arranging the sort of height levels and that kind of thing. An awful lot of herbaceous borders are beautiful. I think of one outstanding garden in Yorkshire, but it's rather long for its width. So there you are. The other thing, which you can see best in the next slide, is it's got these yew buttresses punctuating the length, and you can see it more easily there, actually. That is in April. And I think it's quite good to look at gardens, as it were, not exactly out of season, but in the winter and early spring. You see the architecture very well, and you can see, I think, the buttresses planted at intervals along, breaking up what could otherwise have been possibly a slightly monotonous long walk. I think you'll follow what I mean. And it was quite clever that. It was about 1870. It was a later edition. I think it was very successful. The other thing which is different now, well, I'll go to the next. No, well, that's the 1846 plan, and there you see the herbaceous border, the alcove at the end, and that's 1846, no buttresses. It was unrelieved. Now you have 4 rectangular beds on either side, punctuated by the buttresses. That is a watercolor painting by an artist called E.A. Rowe, about 1880. Show you that partly because to show that really the structure of the border has really not changed. I mean, that's, it's more. And indeed, we still grow all the same plant. I don't remember any peacocks, but I think that's artist. Well, it may not be. But the other thing which is different is the gravel path. The gravel path which they had. And the story there, that's a photograph of the border with the gravel path. And I remember that very well because it was gravel until 1946. And my parents decided that they would do away with the gravel path and they would make a lawn, grass it down. And actually, interestingly, the reason they did that, honestly, it was labor saving. They thought it would save labor because you wouldn't have to weed killer the path, and there was a little bit less edging, because on that photograph, 1, 2, 3, 4 bits of edging. Now, of course, you only have 2 bits of edging. But of course, everybody said, and I remember this extremely well, of course, Everybody said it looks better, which I think it does. That's just a hand drawing by Roland of his idea of what the finials on the topiary should look like. And I think you'll agree they followed his wishes pretty accurately, really. One or two shots of the border in its various stages. That's end of May, early June. Nothing very much in flower except alliums. A few different kinds of alliums, which look very good, purple and mauve against the various greens. There we are. High summer, probably, delphinium time. One of my favorite periods. I think late June, that is. A bit later in the year, that's early September, late August, and that's a corner at that time also. Now, these gates from the border into, you'll see later, the walled garden, rather grand gates constructed by, or the instructions of Roland and Mary, quite fine, into what is now the walled garden, and my mother, who's been referred to a lot so far and will be referred to again, she was at Arley all through the Second World War. My father was away with the war, and she was very, very good at preventing the requisitioning, which happened in a lot of places. You see very elaborate ironwork, tracery. You can't see them, but there are initials up there, and rather beautiful. And in a lot of places, the government took all this ironwork, melted it down for the war effort. You can see why they did it, of course. But it was rather wonderful when they weren't able to do it, and my mother was very good at stopping them doing that. Really, and a lot of other things too at Arley. Other views, see the vista with the stable clock in the distance, and there, this is another view again. Now, if the herbaceous border is the feature at Arley for which we're best known, there's no doubt at all, in my opinion, that the most interesting feature at Arley is the one you're just about to see now. We're walking, this sweet little girl is walking away from it. It's not our granddaughter, and there it is. That is the Ilex Avenue. Now, it's a little bit of a misnomer because, as you will know, ilex, the botanical name for holly. They're not hollies. They're oaks, evergreen oaks, home oaks. Botanical name Quercus ilex, but we call it the Ilex Avenue. And it is a bit special, actually. Indeed, I believe it to be unique. I don't mean that home oaks are unique, and of course, there are a lot of those come from southern France and Mediterranean, but you don't often see clipped like that, and I've never heard or seen of them clipped into this shape, which is giant cylinders, about 30 feet high. There are 7 on either side of the central avenue, so either side. It's said that when they were first, well, in fact, we know when they were first planted, they were intended, and I'll show that in a moment, they were intended to be conical. I'll show you that in a moment. In the First World War, they got out of shape, and people decided that they should be cylindrical. And there's a rather amusing story attached to this, because my great-grandfather had a brother-in-law called James Bateman, who lived and gardened, you know about it, lived and gardened at an important garden now in the hands of the National Trust and in very good heart, called Biddulph Grange in Staffordshire. And the brothers-in-law were both very keen gardeners. They corresponded and talked about gardening and compared notes. And Roland said he was going to plant Quercus ilex, and James Bateman thought that was a bad idea. And this is a letter he wrote to him, and you can't read it, but what it says is he advised against it. He said they won't make it, they won't stand the knife. That's the actual phrase in that letter. They won't stand the knife, meaning that you won't be able to clip them because you'll put them under stress and they won't like it. Well, luckily, Roland took no notice at all. He went ahead, planted them, and apart from the 1981-82 winter when we were worried about them, they didn't put on growth for several months, but they've been fine. And so it's a wonderful feature to have. And I told you about the conical shape. That is watercolor of the 19th century, and you can indeed see conical shape. This is a view of the Ilex Avenue from the foreground area, which we call the Fish Garden, another one of my mother's creations. And two things to say about this. A very happy plant association my mother thought of. 2 or 3 different kinds of Philadelphus, Belle Etoile and Beauclerk, and a very good floribunda pink rose called Erfurt. Very good plant association, wonderful scent from the Philadelphus. The other thing I must draw to your attention is the Zoe urns. Those are called the Zoe urns because they are 18th century solid stone. They were on the columns of a house near Arley called Marbury, and my mother all her life had coveted these. Marbury got into the hands of a demolition contractor. The place was knocked down. These urns still remained on the columns, and my father was in a correspondence with the demolition contractor trying to buy these urns, getting no answer at all. Zoe and I got married in 1971. She's a forthright girl, my wife. Got on the telephone to this chap, not the sort of thing my father would have done. Got on the telephone, said, my father-in-law's been writing letters to you. You hadn't answered them. Can we have these urns? Anyway, we got them 50 quid the pair. As they were 18th century solid stone, and we put them there. So that's the Zoe urns for you. And wonderful to get those. A view into the park from the foreground, the Sundial Circle. I talked earlier about views into the park, but you see I think you can see what I mean. It's good. You get various vistas. Right, he's the artist, Piers Edgerton Warburton, Roland's son, my great-grandfather, and he's the guy that painted the view, which I showed you, and an awful lot of other buildings. And that's his wife, Antoinette. She was Antoinette Sommeries, came from the Channel Islands, Guernsey, and she was lovely. I used to hear about her from I had various great aunts that I knew extremely well. Obviously, they were daughters of this lady, Antoinette, and she was obviously a charming person. It was said that she was a little bit diffident, and I think this is pretty good rubbish, really, but quiet, diffident person, shy. It was said that she wanted an area where she could go and enjoy herself near the entrance to the garden at Arley. Didn't want to go right down to the far end. So anyway, she created this area, which we call the Flag Garden, and that is much as it's always looked. We now have floribunda roses and bedding out there. And that's I have a particular affection for the Flag Garden because my mother, before we opened the garden to the public, which we did in the 1960s, the gardeners were never allowed to come down here because this is where my mother did her sort of private gardening. She used to work there. When I was a small boy, I would very often be with her, and so I remember it with great affection and nostalgia. And I remember, incidentally, the predecessor of that statue, because I was there on one occasion with a friend, a little girl. We were both 5 years old. She was called Jenny, and Jenny and I were playing around, and we managed to pull that statue or its predecessor right down on top of us. To the consternation of our mothers, we didn't think anything of it, and it did us no harm at all. Another view of the Flag Garden in the spring, magnolia, solangiana, the back, and bedding out. That is my grandmother, Lettice Lee. She came from a wonderful property in Cheshire called Lyme Park, a very, very grand place, which is now in the hands of the National Trust. And she married my mother's father, my grandfather, John Edgerton Warburton, who very sadly was, like so many, the victim of the First World War. He died of wounds in 1915. So he never had a chance to make his mark at Arley, which is sad. But my grandmother married again. She married a lovely man, my step-grandfather, called Dallas Waters. And they were at Arley in charge in the 1920s and 30s. Now, the 1920s and 30s were not the sort of high spot of gardening at Arley. I'm trying to get across the point that each generation of a family has made a contribution to the place. And while trying to preserve the best of what went before, they're trying to create new features, and that is still going on today. Just before we get on to what my grandmother did, I'd just like to point out the structure of Arley is very, very important, and design. But here you see you have the brick walls, kitchen garden, another kitchen garden there. You have the yew hedges there. You've got yew hedges. 1 second. That is the herbaceous border. yew hedge there. So you can, I hope, imagine that this structure gives a strong design, and it enables you to get the element of surprise, which I think is very important in a garden. You don't see everything at once. You go around a corner and you see something new. So there we are. Well, what my grandmother did, incidentally, there was a maze at Arley in my child. That was there. Sad, but Hornbeam maze, that was demolished. Anyway, there you go. That is an area, Bowling Green, and my grandmother carved out of that an area which is now the fish garden, another formal area which she made there. I'm moving on a bit rapidly now because I've got a lot more to say. That's a seat at the end, rather nice ornamental seat. Very important to have a lot of seats in a garden. It's not only the elderly and infirm that like sitting down at all. People like taking the weight off their feet, and you want to have a few strategically positioned in nice, cozy corners where people can relax and do it. And there you go. Anyway, so that's that. And this is the view which the couple on that seat would be looking at. The fish garden itself in the front, a few of the Quercus ilexes, and then the view beyond into the park. Now that is my mother, who you've heard about, and she, without question, had a greater effect and influence on the garden at Arley than anybody since the 19th century. That is taken about 1977. She was a remarkable person, as Alan has told you. She was very artistic. She loved gardening. She was extremely intelligent, very energetic, and her philosophy, as I think indicated, was that she wanted to do things in the garden which might improve it while retaining the best of the past. And it's important to say that for about 10 years after the war, we had engaged in market gardening, all still the war effort, as it were, still going on, food production, but it wasn't terribly successful, and my parents didn't really enjoy it. And so they thought, well, we'll give it a go. We'll try and really make the garden once again ornamental. It had been well known 100 years before. It was Gertrude Jekyll wrote about it. It was in Country Life, the magazine, in 1904, so it was known as a garden, but my mother did great things in it, much supported by my father, who wasn't particularly a gardener, though he was a good farmer. He understood about how things grow, and he was an enormous support and encouragement, and there they are at their golden wedding in 1984. The first area that my mother tackled was the rose garden. Now that is a formal rose garden. Before her, I can remember it extremely well, of course. You've got topiary in the front, you've got in front of the tea cottage, can't see it really, but formal tea roses. Now my mother wasn't a great lover of tea roses in gardens. She saw the value for cut flowers with their wonderful scent and colour, but she didn't tremendously admire them in gardens. She thought they were a bit, I don't know what she thought, but she did. Anyway, what she did like, very much indeed, were the old-fashioned shrub roses, which Alan mentioned. She was very influenced by that wonderful gardener, Vita Sackville-West, who made a world-class garden at Sissinghurst in Kent, and also she was influenced by Graham Stuart Thomas, one of the really great horticulturalists, I would suggest, of our generation. And they had both made a huge study of shrub roses, and my mother completely fell in love with them. So she scrapped the formal rose area, and she created a collection of shrub roses. That slide doesn't show it particularly well, but you can see that it's the same area, and you've got shrub roses on either side in front of the tea cottage. And we've now got, I think, we've got about 80 or so different varieties of species and hybrids, and they make a wonderful show in June and July. They're mostly, not exclusively, but mostly not repeat flowering, but that's a little bit more of them closer up to the tea cottage. Tea cottage is really a folly, 19th century conversion of an 18th century building, and it's fully equipped as a little house, a chimney, and in the Victorian times they used to have tea parties there, and of course it's wonderful for children. Very nice to have a few buildings in gardens. They break the place up and they give character. Shrub rose area, roses not in flower, but I love that slide with the irises in the foreground. That is shrub roses looking into the park. That is an area which my mother attacked too. How are we doing? All right. That is called the rootery, and Zoe has absolutely rightly said you must explain that that is in course of making. It's in course of creation, and that's my great-great-grandmother Mary, and they're making a rock garden which was devoted to, those are all paving stones, and for rock plants. And they're called rootery because on the right they introduced a lot of stumps and trees, roots of old trees. It was quite a fashionable thing to do, and they grew plants up them. And their roots, of course, still there. But the point is that that was extremely labor-intensive, the alpine plants. So my mother scrapped, well, they didn't survive the Second World War, there just wasn't the labor for them. So she altered that and she transformed it and introduced a lot of shrubs, in particular deciduous azaleas, which are absolutely wonderful scent. A lot of them, you will know these very well because, of course, the parents are native to the United States in many cases, and really very, very good and wonderful scent with the flame-colored azaleas. And there's another view of them. Certainly gets the cameras clicking in April and May. That is a good plant association of Azaleas and Mechanopsis grandis, the blue flower, which is a good association, I think. And another good plant association in the rootery is hostas. We've got a lot of hostas, and they go very well with the azaleas. And there's the rootery in its autumn plumage. Now we come out of the rootery. I just show you that because that's one of my favorite shrubs. Cornus controversa variegata, sometimes called the wedding cake tree because branches splay out in a rather wonderful way. And I'm very keen on, we don't want too many of them, but I'm very keen on variegated foliage. So that's what that is. We now come to what is now the walled garden, and probably my mother's greatest creation, I think. She turned what had previously been a kitchen garden with fruit trees and vegetables. It's now entirely ornamental. That's the center of it. The fountain in the middle is made of phosphor bronze, created by a sculptor called Tom Leaper from Cornwall, and it was the present gift from a wonderful, I think I've referred to the Friends of Arley, organization supports the estate, and that was given as a memorial to my mother, and we're very pleased with that. Another view of the center of the walled garden, as is that. Moving on a little bit quicker now. That is the herb garden, self-explanatory from its name, full of various different sorts of herbs. Maybe you can see that was on a building in Piccadilly Circus in London, bombed, and then the gardeners pick out the box hedges. Do you see what I'm indicating? The shape. Rather fun. That was made by my mother off an old rubbish heap. The scented garden, everything's supposed to have a scent. Now we come to the present day. This is my wife Zoe has been responsible for this area. I refer to the fact that my father's family came from Ireland, and they left in 1922. This is, we call the Arbor. It's a rather beautiful wirework structure of about 1820, which had been at Castle Darrow in Ireland. My father remembered it. And when the nuns, who had the property for many decades, when they left, we managed to, they gave us this structure. We got it over, dismantled it, got it over, restored it, and put it in the middle of what is now a kitchen garden. And we realized you couldn't see it terribly well, so planted a yew hedge behind, which is very successful because you can see it well. And yew grows very, very much more quickly than people tell you. It really does. That photograph, the yew hedge, about 12 years old. Possibly 15, but certainly not more. And the border, which Zoe has made, border on either side, we call it the Arbor Walk, and that does vary throughout the summer. And there you get, looking the other way, at what we call the Arbor Seat, which is a nice place to sit. Now, just to show we still do grow vegetables, This is the kitchen garden, and there's Mr. Scarecrow. That is the vinery, looking back, 19th century greenhouse, and that is the interior of it, which is open to the public in the summer, where we is sort of show house. Now we come to where I've been very involved over the last 35 years. This is the Grove, the other side of Arley Hall. This is a completely different concept, woodland garden, a different standard of maintenance required, different concept. This is, the main garden is formal and structured. This is informal, not structured enough, actually, I think, but nevertheless, it's informal in concept and theme, and the visitors actually do love it because they feel relaxed down there. That's obviously in the autumn, and then spring. We've got there, down there, well, between 500 and 1,000, well, near 1,000, different varieties of woody plants, trees, shrubs, over 400 different varieties of rhododendron. I'm a complete rhodaholic, but we have acers, oaks, birches, cornices, wonderful plants, cherries, magnolias, you name it, we try and have it. There we are. You see what I mean? It's a completely different theme. Now that is the most wonderful plant on the left. Don't know why it's not grown more, called Exocorda. Wonderful thing. Exocorda macrantha the bride, in flower for weeks. Oh, there we are. I'm rushing ahead now. Magnolia time. Sister Jane, you've already seen a photograph of her. She makes a very big contribution. She has made a wonderful garden in this area, which is, that's Arley Hall. This is what I've been looking at with you. And this is the East Garden, formal Victorian garden. And she's turned that is a view of Arley Hall from her garden. And that's what she's turned it into, aerial view. That's about 20 years' work. Look again at the yew hedges. Rapid growth. And that's that. Now, in the time which remains to me, I'm keeping a very careful watch on the clock. I just wanted to show you a few plants which I think make a particular impact at Arley, which are special favourites of mine. We start with a couple of climbers. That is a wonderful one. I don't know whether you have it, Alan. It's a wonderful one called Ascisa phragma hydrangioides. It's a member of the hydrangea family. That is a form called rosea. Beautiful thing, a little bit tender, but perfectly right up against the south-facing wall. And that is a very good plant. That is an abutilon milleri, parents native to Brazil. And that stays in flower for many weeks in the summer. Wonderful thing. Now my rhododendrons. Rhododendrons, ladies and gentlemen, I think is the most wonderful genus. Wonderful. I don't know of any other genus which has such variety, such a range. You get forest-sized trees. You get tiny little plants a few inches high. You get deciduous. You get evergreen. You get almost every color in the rainbow except a clear blue. So-called blue rhododendrons are really violet or lavender or purple. None the worse for that, but they're not a clear blue. But you get every other color there is. And I absolutely love them. Some of them are scented, most are not. Some are tender, most are not. That is a very good yellow called Damaris. Lems, Monarch, an awful lot of hybrids are made in the United States, as you will know. Tremendous interest in America in rhododendron hybridizing, and been enormously successful, actually. And of course, you have all your wonderful deciduous ones, the azaleas. That is a very good yellow called Hotii hybrid. Wonderful, that's rhododendron thompsoni. That is a species which we've actually seen. We've once been to the Himalayas, seen that growing in its native habitat. And ladies and gentlemen, there's no more exciting thing to do, is there, than seeing plants growing in their native habitat. It's really absolutely amazing. That is a marvelous species, one of the very best, rhododendron yakashimanum, fairly brought in 1934, I think, and has been a parent of a tremendous number of wonderful hybrids. That is a beautiful thing on its own, but it's produced a tremendous number of hybrids which have the great value that they're very compact plants, so they're ideal for small, what I call small, normal-sized gardens. Augustinii, wonderful blue species from which has come a tremendous number of so-called blue hybrids. That is almost my most favorite of all. When I was at Winter Tour 2 nights ago, somebody in a question said, what is your most favorite plant? One single favorite plant. That's a difficult question, isn't it? Anyway, I gave him an answer. You have to, don't you, really? Rhododendron wardii, Ludlow, and Sheriff-form. So there you go. There you go. And lovely yellow, orbicular leaves, and that wonderful, I think, dark eye red. Okay, Rhododendron wardii, fairly. These are Pratt hybrids, deciduous azaleas, hybrid race. Awful lot of American parentage in this, Viscosum, Occidentale, a lot of them. And it has a great value. They come out late in June. They're wonderfully scented, and they're wonderful display of colour. Another one there. Foliage, terribly important in rhododendrons. Young foliage, worth growing just for that alone, don't you think? Glaucus, Oreotrephes, that species. Fantastic. Brioravii, look at the endumentum under the leaf. Magnolias, well, I hesitate to talk in your country about magnolias, having been in Philadelphia, having been, you know, where we've been. But we do grow magnolias well. That is Sprangeri, wonderful one. That is Lerbneri Merrill. That's actually at our house. That Soulangiana Lenii, a cross called Proctoriana. That is absolutely charming plant. Rhododendron sinensis, Rhododendron sieboldii, subspecies sinensis. Magnolia, so sorry. Magnolia, start again. Magnolia, what did I say? Sieboldii, subspecies sinensis. Beautiful thing, comes out about a month later than most magnolias. Beautiful scent. Absolutely charming plant. Just very quickly through, try and imagine, these are herbaceous plants in the herbaceous border. These are the kind of things that give you the kaleidoscopic effect in the herbaceous border. Right. Now then, trees. I've got another 5 minutes, Laura, is that right? Do you agree? What? Over already? I've gone already, okay.